There is growing concern about how COVID-19 and health and racial disparities may contribute to voter suppression this November. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns takes a closer look in our new series, America's Right to Vote.
In the lead up to November, you'll hear a lot of this.
Your vote matters.
Please vote.
Get off your butt. Get out and vote.
Just vote.
Vote.
Vote, vote, vote. The future is in your hands.
It seems like an easy course of action, but voting isn't easy for everyone. There are regulations in place that make it harder for some people to vote, and that's no accident.
The vote is the heart of American democracy. We all believe that passionately, but it's also been a big fight over the centuries about how we vote, who votes, and very often people trying to make it harder for other people to vote.
Waldman says barriers to voting are often subtle.
They can look kind of bureaucratic and complex, but in fact, they have the same kind of impact, unfair impact on Black voters and Latino voters of some of the laws from the past. Vote suppression is not just something from long ago newsreels. It happens today. It happens now.
Many of the key restrictions have come over the past decade and involve voter ID laws, cutting back on early voting, eliminating same-day registration, and redistricting.
We may no longer have to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to cast a ballot. But even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting.
The former president said those words in a eulogy for John Lewis, whose activism led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That monumental law banned literacy tests and other discriminatory barriers to voting. It mandated that states and localities with a history of such discrimination seek federal approval to change their voting laws.
The American people heard our cries and responded to our pain and to our suffering.
But in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down that provision, arguing it was based on old data.
What that means practically is there is nothing that stops a state from passing a new law and evaluating first whether or not it's discriminatory, and any effort to stop it has to be after the fact. It's much easier for states to pass discriminatory voting laws.
One of those laws centers on voter ID. A majority of states request that voters present some form of identification in order to cast their ballot. And several key battleground states have strict enforcement measures.
There are people who say, why is it so hard to get an ID?
It's not just, you have to have ID, but it's also that you have to have certain kinds of IDs that Black and Latinx people are often less likely to have.
Experts say the pandemic threatens to make things worse. A shortage of poll workers in November could lead to fewer polling locations and longer lines.
Poll workers are dedicated, but many of them are senior citizens and are at health risk and aren't in a position to do it this year. The lines to vote, long lines, are found in Black communities and Latino communities and not in white communities. That's been documented over and over again.
While many states have expanded the option to vote by mail during the pandemic, several states require witness signatures or notaries. And most states require absentee ballots be returned by Election Day, so threats to Postal Service funding could suppress votes.
They want $25 billion for the post office because the post office is going to have to go to town to get these ridiculous ballots in.
And the Postal Service has warned 46 states and D.C. that ballots sent by mail may not arrive in time to be counted. So election officials say that if you want to get your ballot in, send it as soon as you can. And you don't actually have to rely on the Postal Service. You can bring it to your local clerk's office or put it in a secure drop box. So make sure that your county has one. Elaine, that's something that could help save you on postage.
Some really important advice, Caitlin. Thank you. How has, Caitlin, mail-in voting become such a partisan issue this election?
Well, with the pandemic, many states have tried to expand the option for voters to send in their ballots by mail. You already have 5 states that conduct their elections by mail already before the pandemic, and now you have this expansion. And what's really interesting is that talking to experts and election officials, there isn't a partisan benefit to vote by mail. In other words, one party doesn't benefit over another in terms of voting by mail. But it has become a partisan issue, and mostly because the president has made it one by disparaging mail-in voting and describing it falsely as fraudulent. And that has now had an effect in polling. We see often that Republicans are less inclined than Democrats to support an expansion of vote by mail in their states.
Well, so how has the pandemic impacted access to the ballot box?
Well, there's a huge question heading into November about whether the election can be held safely in a pandemic. And we kind of got a preview over the past few months in various primaries about what this might look like. And we saw in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Georgia, which are all key battleground states in November, during their primaries, we saw that more people wanted to vote by mail. And we also saw that because of a shortage of poll workers, that there were longer lines, especially in places like Georgia. And all of that can be prohibitive and a barrier to voting. So you have in the CARES Act that was passed earlier this year, about $400 million was allocated to help these states conduct the elections. But election officials we've talked to from both parties say that that just isn't enough. They need more resources, not only to conduct the vote by mail and absentee programs, but also for the in-person voting. And that's something that I'm wondering, especially as we have all of these concerns with the post office, whether that might, and the president's disparagement of vote by mail, whether that might prompt even more people to want to show up in person on Election Day.
So we have seen a lot of unsubstantiated claims out there on mail-in voting. How is misleading information potentially affecting the process?
That's right. Cases of voter fraud when it comes to absentee voting are very, very rare. We looked at a Heritage Foundation report that found about 200 instances over more than 2 decades. And those instances were found because they were apprehended. So it is obviously against the law to commit voter fraud. So when the president says that this is a system rife with fraud, that's just not true. And there are various systems in place to make sure the ballot is secure and verified. Some states have a variety of different signature checks to make sure that that's true. But when you do have this conversation, it does raise questions about whether people will in fact feel safe now voting by mail and whether they might want to vote in person. So in order to do that, these states are saying, look, we have to give people options. There are going to be people that don't want to show up in person because of the pandemic. We've got to give them options to be able to submit their ballots. And you see some states changing their laws in real time. Last week, Kentucky, for example, made a bipartisan agreement to allow the pandemic to be an excuse for voters to vote absentee if they want to.
And very quickly, Caitlin, what should we expect? Will this be an election night result or election week result?
I think that we should make no plans for the month of November. We've been talking to election officials and experts who say that it's going to take a while to count these ballots, mostly because several key states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, they're not even allowed to start opening up mail-in ballots until Election Day. But it's really important to make sure our audience knows that that does not mean that the integrity of the election is at stake. It just is going to take a little while to count those ballots.
All right, really important context for people to understand heading into November. Caitlin Huey-Burns for us. Caitlin, thank you very much.
Thank you.